Wild Mustang trapped in a raging flood fighting for his life for hours. He struggled against the relentless current, his body battered, his strength fading. Noon thought they would make it, but then against all odds, someone appeared. What happened next will leave you speechless. This is a story of survival, courage, and a bond. That Noon saw coming, the first raindrops had started falling. Just before sunset light, at first barely more than a drizzle, but within an hour the skies had opened, unleashing an unrelenting torrent of water upon the valley. By midnight, the river had swollen beyond its banks. The once dry plains had transformed into a raging sea of muddy, merciless waters, wallowing trees, fences, and anything in its path, and in the middle of it one. Mustang was fighting for his life. Storm had been roaming free in this land for years. She had outrun cowboys, escaped pens, and conquered drought. She was wild, untouchable, a survivor, but had never faced anything like this. The flood had caught them off. Guard had been grazing near the river when the ground beneath him vanished. The sudden force of the water had ripped him from solid ground, dragging him downstream before he could react. Now he was fighting against the full fury of nature itself. His hooves kicked desperately, but the current was too strong. Each time he tried to gain footing, the water pulled him deeper. Branches, tree trunks, and debris crashed past him, some hitting his body with brutal force. His powerful muscles burned his lungs, screamed for air, but they refused to give up for hours. She fought the cold, seeped into his bones, his movements, lowering his head, barely stayed above the churning surface. The weight of exhaustion dragged him down. Then a massive trunk came barreling toward him. Storm barely saw it in time to move, but his body wasn't fast enough anymore. The log slammed into his side, spinning him violently. His legs went numb, his breath ripped from his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. He was going under. Daniel Carter gripped the steering wheel of his truck, staring through the heavy rain pounding against the windshield. He had seen plenty of storms before, but not like this. The whole valley was underwater. Rivers had swallowed roads, ranches had turned into island scattle, and horses had been lost. The radio crackled beside him. The roads are flooded. If you're still out there, jet a high ground. The sheriff's voice warned. Daniel didn't respond. He just sat there, jaw clenched, watching the dark, chaotic floodwaters rage outside. He had spent most of his life running into danger, first as a soldier, then as a firefighter. He had saved lives, pulled people out of burning buildings, carried children from the wreckage of car crashes, and years ago he had paid the price. Now all he wanted was silence, no more rescues, no more losing anyone. But then something moved in the water. At first, the thought it was a fallen branch, but then it struggled. His pulse jumped. It was a horse, a black Mustang, barely keeping its head above the water. The animal kicked against the current, fighting for life. But Daniel could see it was losing. Damn it. Daniel exhaled, squeezing his eyes shut. He told himself to look away. He told himself it wasn't his problem. Then the Mustang's head went under, and Daniel threw the truck into gear. Daniel barely felt the truck skid as she slammed the accelerator, tires slicing through the flooded road. His wipers fought against the rain. But the world outside was still a blurry mess of darkness and water. This is a mistake, his mind screamed at him, reminding him why he had sworn never to do this again. But his hand stayed tight on the wheel, his jaw locked through the sheets of rain. Hazal would again, the struggling black shape barely staying above the water. The Mustang was losing the fight. Daniel's truck roared through the floodwater, shed-lights flashing across the destruction. The river had swallowed the valley, turning the once familiar dirt roads into a raging current. Fence posts floated like twigs, dead branches swirled in whirlpools, and in the center of a tall storm, the Mustang's head bobbed, barely visible in the chaos. His legs kicked weakly, his energy nearly gone. One wrong move, and he lost. Daniel's heart pounded. He needed to act. Now he slammed the truck into park, wrenched the door open, and stepped into the freezing floodwaters. The shock hit. Instantly, the current was strong, too strong. His boots slipped against the emerged ground. As the water reached his waist to see, and unforgiving, he braced himself, gripping the door for balance. Storm's head went under again. Daniel lunged forward. The Mustang surfaced with a desperate snort, his wide eyes full of panic. His body was covered in cuts from the debris, his black coat slick with water. Daniel took another step, the current pulling at claws. She had to get closer. Come on, kid, he muttered, forcing himself forward. Just a little longer. Storm's ears flicked, but his body was shutting down. Daniel pushed forward, his boots dragging over submerged debris. A broken fence post slammed into his side, but he barely felt it. Nothing else mattered. Storm's eyes locked onto his. Daniel didn't think he reached. His fingers brushed wet, for then the Mustang thrashed. A sudden surge of panic, a final burst of survival. Storm kicked out hard. His hooves slammed into Daniel's ribs. Pain exploded through his chest. The impact sent them stumbling backward, the current snatching him off his feet. The freezing flood swallowed him whole. Darkness, cold silence. Daniel's world spun up, became down. His lungs screamed for air as the water dragged him deeper, twisting him like a rag doll. His fingers clawed against the current. But there was nothing to grab. A voice deep in his mind whispered, This is how it ends, but something else is something stronger answered back, not yet summoning every ounce of strength. Daniel kicked hard, fighting the weight of the water. His hand shot forward and closed around something solid, a rope, goddamn fence rope. Head grabbed it with all he had, his body jerking to as to pass. The current tried to rip him away. His head broke the surface air, freezing air, cuffing, gasping. He looked up. Storm was still there, barely. The Mustang's legs had stopped kicking. His body was sinking. Daniel was out of time, ignoring the pain, ignoring everything. He pushed forward. Again, this time Storm didn't fight. His hand grasped the horse's soaked mane. She reached under, wrapping his arm around the Mustang's powerful neck. Not today. Daniel growled, "You're not dying today," with the last of his strength. He started pulling. Daniel's grip on Storm's waterlogged man was slipping. His arms creamed from the effort, this body barely keeping both of them above the raging flood. The Mustang's weight was dead against them, too heavy, too exhausted, and the current wasn't slowing. Each second dragged them farther away, deeper into the flood zone, away from solid ground. The river had transformed the valley into a chaotic, swirling nightmare of debris, broken fences, and uprooted trees. Storm's eyes were half closed, his chest rising and falling in slow, labored breath. She was shutting down. Daniel clenched his jaw. "Not happening, not today," gritting his teeth. Head adjusted his grip, securing his arm around Storm's neck. The Mustang didn't resist the wasp, past fighting, past fear. His body was spent, the only thing keeping him alive now was Daniel, and he wasn't about to let go. Every ounce of strength he had left. They kicked hard, trying to steer them toward a cluster of trees jutting out of the water. Ahead, it was their only shot. His muscles screamed, his ribs throbbed from the kick. Storm had landed earlier, but it pushed forward one stroke, then another. The freezing water tried to steal his breath, but it kept this focus locked on the partially submerged oak tree. Ahead, it was 10 feet away. Storm's body sagged heavier against them. 5T. Daniel's vision blurred. His grip was failing. His strength was running out. 3 feet. A massive wave surged forward, dragging them sideways. The tree was slipping away 1 foot. With a final desperate lunge, Daniel threw out his hand and caught the lowest branch. Pain shot through his shoulder as the weight of Storm and the force of the current threatened to rip him away. But it held on. Grimacing, he wrapped his arm tighter around the Mustang's neck, using his free hand to haul them closer. The Mustang front hove shit solid bark. A weak sound escaped Storm's throat, a breath, a flicker of life. Daniel didn't stop, fought against the freezing water, pushing Storm up, forcing him onto the submerged roots. The Mustang collapsed against the base of the tree chest. The aving Daniel followed, slamming his back against the bark, gasping for air for the first time in hours. They weren't drowning. The world spun around him, his factus entire body trembling from exhaustion. His ribs throbbed where Storm had kicked him, but they were alive. Storm let out a weak, trembling breath. His ears flicked slightly, but his body didn't move. He was completely drained. Daniel reached out, running a hand over the Mustang's slick, shivering body. Hanging the rebutty. The flood still raged around them. The storm unrelenting. The water was rising, but for now they had a moment. They had survived for now. But Daniel knew the truth. If he didn't find a way to get Storm to dry land soon, the Mustang wouldn't make it, and neither would he. Daniel's entire body ached. His limbs were numb from the freezing water, his muscles stiff from exhaustion. Every breath felt like fire in his chest, but he didn't have time to think about paint. A flood was still rising. Storm lay collapsed against the base of the oak tree, his sides rising and falling with shallow, weak breath. His soaked black coat clung to his body, revealing sharp ribs beneath. He was running out of time. Daniel ran a shaking hand over the Mustang's shoulder. "Come on, big eye," he muttered voice. "Horse, you're not dying here." Storm's ears flicked slightly, but his body didn't move, too weak, too cold. Daniel glanced around, trying to assess their situation. The floodwaters stretched in every direction, wallowing everything: fences, barns, entire pastures gone. There was no road, no escape. He wallowed. The only chance they had was a distant patch of land, barely visible above the waterline, a small rise in the valley where the ground hadn't been completely overtaken, but it was at least a quarter mile away, and Storm couldn't swim that far. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing his mind to focus. Think. The tree was solid. Its trunk thick and sturdy, despite the flood. A few branches stretched outward, just high enough to keep from being swallowed by the rising water. He turned his gaze to a long piece of barbed wire, fencing tangled around the trunk, half submerged. An idea formed instantly. It was insane, but insanity was all he had left. He grabbed the fencing, ignoring the sting of sharp metal cutting into his fingers, and began twisting the loose wires together, creating a crude but strong lead. Storm was too weak to move on his own, but Daniel could pull him if he could tie the makeshift lead to Storm, secure it around his neck and chest. That could guide him through the floodwaters towards safety. Assuming, of course, that neither of them drowned first. "This is the dumbest thing I've ever done," he muttered under his breath. Storm let out a weak snort, almost like a response. It was faint, but it was something. Daniel tightened his grip. "Yeah, well, respect if you don't fight, none of this matters." Storm's ears flicked again. Daniel took that as a sign to keep going. He moved quickly, working the wire into a firm but secure harness around the Mustang's chest. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold when he was sure the lead was tight but not choking. Daniel pressed a hand against the horse's damp coat. "Okay, guy, time to get up." Storm didn't move. Daniel exhaled sharply, bracing himself. He couldn't wait with a deep breath. He grabbed the lead and pulled the Mustang's muscles, twitched his legs, shifting slightly. "Come on," Daniel urged voice. Raw from exhaustion, "I know you've got fight left." Storm's breathing quickened, his front legs trembled, then pushed. Daniel pulled harder. Storm grunted, his body lifted an inch. Then another. Daniel's arms screamed, his muscles burning from strain, but it kept pulling. And then Storm's legs locked with one last burst of strength. The Mustang shoved himself upright, the staggered side sheaving, but he was standing. Daniel, too out of breath of pure relief. For the first time since the flood began, they had aerial chance, but now came the hardest part. Could they survive the final stretch? Storm was standing, but barely. His legs trembled, his breathing was shallow, and his head hung low, exhaustion threatening to pull him back down. Daniel tightened his grip on the makeshift lead, his own body shaking from cold and exhaustion. He could feel the weight of the Mustang against them. If Storm collapsed again, there wouldn't be ace-con chance. The flood watch stretched ahead, dark and unpredictable. Between the man's safety was nearly a 4-mile of rotbow of raging water, and if they didn't move, now they wouldn't make it. Daniel's fingers burned against the twisted wire. Leadership braced himself against the current and took one deep breath, then pulled. Storm didn't move. Daniel grit his teeth. "Come on, big eye, I didn't drag your ass out of the river just to let you die here." Storm flicked an ear, but his legs remained frozen. Daniel pulled again, harder, the wire cut deeper into his palms. Storm let out a weak grunt, his hooves shifting slightly in the mud. "That's it," Daniel muttered, one step at a time. The Mustang took another hesitant step, then another, his legs shaky but determined. Daniel moved with him, guiding him forward. Each step a battle against the current. The floodwaters surged around them, cold and relentless. Every few seconds they brushed past broken fences, floating logs, even a drowned calf. Storm flinched at the wreckage, his body tensing under Daniel's grip. "It's just water." Daniel said, his voice is strained. "Ignore it, keep moving." Storm hesitated. The no-bead, the water grew deeper, rising past Daniel's waist. This boot struggled for traction on the uneven ground below. Storm stumbled, his nearly giving out. Daniel yanked on the lead, keeping him upright. "Don't stop," he barked. "Keep going." Storm's snorted, ears pinning back another few steps. Then another. They were halfway. Daniel's legs burned, his arms felt like lead, the muscles screaming from effort. They had spent everything he had dragging this horse out of the river. He was running one empty, but then he saw with the land a small submerged patch of dry earth, barely big enough for both of them to stand on. It was so close, but between the man's safety. The current was at its strongest, a deep, powerful undertow ripped through the water, dragging debris into its swirling depths. One wrong step and they'd be gone. Daniel turned to Storm. The Mustang's legs were shaking violently, his body was drenched, his head low, but his eyes still held fire. Daniel clenched his jaw. "You've got no more pushing you, don't you?" Storm let out a rough breath. Daniel tightened his grip, and then they ran. Daniel gritted his teeth and pulled. The water roared around them, stronger than before. Each step forward was a battle against the current, against exhaustion, against fear. Storm stumbled. Daniel yanked hard on the lead, keeping the Mustang from going down if he fell. Now it was over. The river's final stretch was a vortex of destruction. Uprooted trees twisted in the water, forming dangerous obstacles. The undertow zucked at their legs, dragging them sideways. Daniel planted his feet, refusing to be taken. "Move, Storm," he shouted over the noise. The Mustang's snorted eyes wild, his muscles trembled, but it pushed forward another step. Then another. Daniel felt his own legs going numb, his boots were useless. The ground beneath him was gone. Then disaster. A massive wave of floodwaters surged toward them, carrying a floating tree trunk, the size of a cardinal. Pulses spiked. They wouldn't survive a hit. Here acted instantly, yanking Storm sideways. Just the logs slammed into the water beside them, sending a freezing mud over their heads. Storm screamed. The Mustang reared up, kicking wildly, breaking free from Daniel's grip. No, Storm lost this footing. His body flipped backward, head first into the current. Daniel lunged, his fingers grasping at thin air. The Mustang vanished beneath the surface. Daniel's breath ripped from his chest. Not like this. Without hesitation, he dived after him. The waters swallowed him whole. Darkness, silence, cold. Daniel's body rolled, violently trapped in the river's grip. He forced his eyes open, searching the shadows. Storm's inking. Daniel kicked hard, reaching out, his fingers brushed wet fur. He grabbed hold. The Mustang twitched, his body limp. Daniel wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, fighting to pull them both up. The surface was too far. His lungs burned, his vision blurred. Move, a final desperate kick, and they broke through. Daniel gasped for air, dragging Storm's head above water. The Mustang wasn't moving. Daniel's heart pounded, non-ousing the last of his strength. He hauled Storm toward the land. The shore was just feet away. One last pull. They hit solid ground. Daniel collapsed, dragging Storm with him. For a moment there was only silence. Then Storm coughed. Daniel's entire body sagged in relief. The Mustang's eyes fluttered open, his chest rising in ragged breaths. Daniel let out a hoarse laugh. "You damn horse," he muttered. "You better be worth this." Storm snorted weakly. They had made it, but now the hardest choice of all. The storm had finally passed. The floodwaters still raged behind them, but Daniel and Storm had made it. They lay on the narrow patch of solid ground, both too exhausted to move. Daniel's entire body throbbed, his arms felt like lead, his ribs ached from Storm's earlier kick, and every breath came with a sharp pain in his chest. But he was alive, and so was Storm. The Mustang lay beside him, his black coat soaked and matted with mud. His chest rose, and Felon's low-labored breath, his ears flicking weakly. Daniel turned his head toward him. They had survived hell together. And now we had a choice to make, he had sworn. He wouldn't care, sworn he. He wouldn't get involved. But as she lay there listening to Storm's ragged breathing, watching the way, the Mustang's dark eyes stayed locked onto his something inside him. Shifted. This horses should have died, but had didn't, because Daniel didn't let them. Daniel swallowed hard, pushing himself upright. This muscle screamed in protest, but he ignored them. He reached out, placing a steadying hand on Storm's shoulder. The Mustang didn't flinch. That was when Daniel knew Storm wasn't afraid of him. Any more slowly, Daniel got to his feet, his legs shaky but strong enough to hold him. Storm watched him. Daniel exhaled. Guess, I can't leave you here, huh? Storm's ears twitched. He let out a weak breath, shifting slightly, but he was too weak to stand alone. Daniel sighed. You're making this really damn difficult, the muttered. But even Asha said if they knew the truth, Storm wasn't just another wild horse anymore. They had survived together. That meant something. With a deep breath, Daniel reached down, gripping the makeshift lead still wrapped around Storm's chest. Come on, Big Eye, he said, voice firm and more time. Storm's ears flicked. Daniel pulled gently. The Mustang grunted, legs trembling, his muscles quivered, fighting against exhaustion. Daniel didn't let go. You've got this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Storm pushed his legs locked, and he stood. Daniel, out of breath, hadn't know. He was holding Storm's, weighed slightly but stayed on his feet. Daniel gave a tired nod. Not bad. Storm let out a weak snort. Daniel chuckled. Yeah, you're tough. I get it. For a long moment, they just stood there side by side. The only sound found the wind rustling through the flooded valley. Then Storm took one step closer, and Daniel felt the connection. He had spent years running from pain, from loss, from responsibility. But this was different. This wasn't a burden, it was a second chance. Her in a hand through his wet hair, letting out a slow breath. All right, Storm, he mutter. Edlatungo home. The Mustang didn't resist. They just followed step by step together. Sometimes the ones we save end up saving us. Storm fought for his life. But in the end, maybe it wasn't just his life that was saved. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves stories of survival and second chances.